The sound of tires crunching on gravel made Jake Thornton glance up from his morning coffee. A tow truck was pulling into his driveway, its hazard lights flashing like a warning. Jake narrowed his eyes as a pudgy man in an ill-fitting uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand, looking smug. "Morning, sir," the man said, adjusting his belt. "We're here to remove the unauthorized equipment from your property." Jake frowned. "Unauthorized what now?" "Your tractor," the man replied, jerking a thumb toward Jake's old but reliable John Deere parked near the barn. "It's in violation of community aesthetic standards." Jake let out a slow, disbelieving chuckle. "Buddy, you must be lost. This is my ranch. Ain't no community aesthetic standards out here." The man smirked, pulling a crumpled letter from his clipboard and handing it over. Jake's eyes scanned the official-looking document, stamped with an all-too-familiar seal, Willow Creek Homeowners Association. A knot tightened in his stomach. He wasn't part of any HOA. His ranch sat on land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, well beyond the subdivision boundaries. Yet here it was, a notice claiming his property now fell under extended HOA jurisdiction, and he had exactly 5 days to comply or face legal consequences. Jake exhaled through his nose, folding the paper and tucking it into his back pocket. "Tell you what, you touch that tractor, and you'll be the one getting towed out of here." The tow truck driver hesitated, looking toward his partner, a lanky man nervously chewing gum. "We got orders," the driver muttered. "Yeah? Well, I've got a shotgun, a bad temper, and nothing to lose," Jake replied casually, leaning against the barn wall. The 2 men exchanged a look before hurriedly climbing back into the truck and pulling away, gravel spitting from their tires. Jake shook his head, muttering under his breath. He had dealt with a lot of nonsense in his life. Bucking broncos, dishonest ranch hands, even a tornado that nearly took out his barn. But an HOA trying to claim his land? That was a whole new breed of stupid. By noon, he was sitting at the local diner, the letter flattened on the counter beside his half-eaten burger. Across from him, Marge Donnelly, his nearest neighbor and longtime friend, let out a snort. "Those HOA idiots finally came for you, huh?" she said, stirring her iced tea. "I warned you, Jake. Helen Grimshaw's got her claws in everything now." Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "So this Helen lady, she's the one behind this?" Marge nodded. "President of the HOA. Thinks she's some kind of queen. She's been expanding their reach, claiming they have rights over properties that were never part of the HOA. Most folks around here just pay the fines to avoid trouble." Jake scoffed. "I ain't most folks." "Yeah, well, neither was old Mr. Dawson. Know what happened to him? He refused to pay, so Helen pulled strings with the city. They condemned his property over safety violations. Man had to sell his house for peanuts and move out." Jake clenched his jaw. "That ain't gonna happen to me." That night, he sat on his porch, the summer air thick with the scent of hay and earth, staring at the HOA letter. His lawyer, Sam Whitaker, had already confirmed it was bogus. Legally, they had no authority over his land. But fighting them in court would be expensive and time-consuming. Helen counted on people backing down. The next morning, Jake woke up to another surprise. A neon orange violation notice was nailed to his front gate. Notice of immediate compliance. Livestock must be removed. Non-approved structures must be demolished. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. Jake stood there, barely awake, staring at the paper like it had personally insulted him. His cows, oblivious to their sudden non-compliance, stood chewing cud behind him. His non-approved structures included a barn that had been standing since his grandfather built it in 1954. He tore the notice off the gate and stomped into his truck. 15 minutes later, he was banging on the door of the HOA office, an unassuming brick building in town. The receptionist barely glanced up. "If you're here about a complaint, you can fill out a form." "I ain't complaining," Jake growled. "I'm here to talk to Helen." A few minutes later, He was standing in Helen Grimshaw's office, staring at a woman in her mid-50s with a sharp bob haircut, a pearl necklace, and the smug smile of someone who had never lost a fight. "Ah, Mr. Thornton," she said sweetly. "I was wondering when you'd come in. I assume you're here to settle your violations." Jake crossed his arms. "You know damn well my ranch ain't part of your HOA." Helen's smile didn't waver. "We had a community vote. The majority agreed that expanding our jurisdiction benefits the neighborhood. We want to maintain a certain standard." Jake let out a short laugh. "Lady, my cow's got more standards than you do." Helen's smile twitched. "I'm simply enforcing the rules. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to escalate." Jake leaned forward, resting his hands on her desk. "Escalate all you want, but you ain't got a legal leg to stand on." Helen picked up a stack of papers and tapped them against her desk. "You might want to reconsider. We've already submitted formal complaints to the city about your property. Zoning violations, environmental concerns, noise complaints. Oh, and several neighbors have mentioned feeling unsafe with livestock so close to residential homes." Jake exhaled sharply. "You're bluffing." Helen's grin widened. "Am I?" Jake stormed out, fists clenched. He had gone from mildly annoyed to outright furious. This wasn't about rules. This was about power, and Helen was drunk on it. The next few weeks were hell. Every day, a new fine showed up in his mailbox. A city inspector, clearly coached by the HOA, arrived unannounced to look for violations. A complaint was filed against his rooster, claiming it was a public disturbance. Then, the final straw, a letter threatening legal action to forcibly evict him if he didn't comply. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the paper clenched in his hand. They wanted him gone. They thought they could pressure him into selling, into folding like the rest. He set the letter down, a slow grin creeping onto his face. "All right, Helen," he muttered. "You wanna play dirty? Let's play." Jake didn't just want to win. He wanted to own them. And that's when he got an idea that would change everything. Jake sat on his porch, tapping his fingers against the wooden armrest of his chair. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across his land. The cows were settling in for the night, oblivious to the battle raging between their owner and a group of overreaching busybodies. He had spent the past few days going back and forth with his lawyer, who kept telling him the same thing. Legally, the HOA had no power over him. But legally didn't matter when Helen was willing to use every trick in the book to make his life miserable. The fines kept coming, the city inspectors kept showing up, and now, he had received a letter warning that his ranch would be subjected to further review for potential environmental violations. He wasn't going to win this fight by playing fair. Helen didn't play fair, and if he wanted to beat her, he'd have to think bigger. Then it hit him. The HOA wasn't some all-powerful government agency. It was just a bunch of homeowners who had gotten together to make rules. And like any organization, it had weaknesses. Money, for one. Most HOA boards weren't exactly swimming in cash. They relied on dues, fines, and special assessments to keep running. If an HOA started bleeding money, it became vulnerable. Jake didn't need to fight them in court. He needed to own them. The next morning, he drove into town to visit an old acquaintance, Davy the Shark Henson, a real estate investor who had a habit of sniffing out desperate homeowners looking to sell fast. Jake had never much liked Davy. He was slick, always 2 steps ahead of everyone, and had an unsettling way of smiling like he knew a secret. But today Jake needed that kind of mind. Davy leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together as Jake laid out the situation. When he finished, Davy let out a low whistle. "So let me get this straight. This HOA is harassing you, trying to push you out, and instead of fighting them, you want to buy them out?" Jake nodded. "Exactly. I want to know how many homes in that HOA are in financial trouble. People who are late on dues, struggling with mortgages, looking to sell." Davy's eyes gleamed. "You know, I love a good hostile takeover. Lucky for you, HOAs are almost always in debt. They spend money on stupid things like fountains and security gates, then turn around and nickel and dime homeowners to cover the cost. He tapped a few keys on his laptop, humming to himself. After a few minutes, he let out a chuckle. Well. Looks like your HOA's got some cracks in its foundation. About a dozen homeowners are either behind on their dues or have been trying to sell for months with no luck. That's your in. Jake grinned. How fast can we move? Over the next few weeks, Jake worked quietly, making offers to homeowners who were fed up with Helen's nonsense. Some took the deal immediately, eager to escape the HOA's grasp. Others needed convincing, but it wasn't hard. Jake just had to point out the endless fines, the constant restrictions, and the sheer misery of living under Helen's rule. One by one, the houses started changing hands, and with every new property Jake acquired, his influence in the HOA grew. He kept his name out of it, using Davy and a few other investors to handle the paperwork, ensuring that Helen remained blissfully unaware of what was happening. Meanwhile, Jake had some fun of his own. He and Marge started a small rebellion within the HOA, stirring up trouble in ways Helen never saw coming. One night, Jake replaced all the fancy solar-powered garden lights on HOA properties with motion-activated lights that played loud barn animal sounds whenever someone walked by. Residents woke up to the sounds of cows mooing and roosters crowing every time they stepped outside. The next week, Marge helped distribute fake HOA violation notices, citing people for absurd infractions like unapproved grass height and failure to comply with mandatory seasonal scarecrow decoration. The best prank came when they reprogrammed the HOA's expensive new security gate to randomly open and close whenever Helen approached. The sight of her screaming at the gate while it repeatedly shut in her face was worth every second of planning. But while the pranks were fun, Jake had his eyes set on the real prize, the HOA board itself. The tipping point came when he acquired enough properties to hold a majority vote. Helen, completely unaware of what was about to happen, called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss further enforcement measures against non-compliant residents. Jake strolled in, tipping his hat as Helen's face twisted into a look of pure disbelief. "What is he doing here?" Helen hissed to the other board members. Jake took a seat, stretching his legs out as he pulled out a folder of documents. "Oh, don't mind me, Helen. Just here as a homeowner. Turns out, I own quite a few homes around here now." Helen's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You see, Helen, I've been doing some buying. And wouldn't you know it, I now own the majority of properties in this HOA. And since HOAs operate by vote, that means I get to make some decisions." He flashed a grin. "And my first decision? You're fired." The room went dead silent. One of the board members, an older man who had clearly been bullied into submission for years, let out a small cough. I second that motion." Helen shot up from her chair, slamming her hands on the table. "This is a joke. You can't just buy your way into power." Jake pulled out the HOA's own bylaws and slid them across the table. Page 12, Section 5. If a single entity owns the majority of properties, they have voting control over all board decisions. Your rules, not mine. Helen snatched the papers, her face turning red as she skimmed the text. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her mind scrambling for a way out. Jake leaned back, crossing his arms as he watched the realization sink in. She had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood, pushing people around, making them miserable for no reason other than the fact that she could. And now she had lost everything. "I'll fight this," she spat. Jake shrugged. "Go ahead. But considering you're also being investigated for financial mismanagement of HOA funds, I wouldn't push your luck." Helen's mouth fell open. "That's a lie." Jake smirked. "Is it? Funny thing about people who hate you, they start talking when you're not in charge anymore. I've got copies of some very interesting financial reports. The homeowners are gonna love seeing where all their dues really went." Helen sank back into her chair, her face drained of color. For the first time, she looked small. Defeated. The woman who had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist had just been outmaneuvered in the most humiliating way possible. Jake stood up, stretching. Well, folks, it's been a pleasure. I think we've got a lot of changes to make around here. First order of business? No more ridiculous fines. Second? No more power-hungry presidents running the show. He tipped his hat. Meeting adjourned. As he walked out, he could hear the murmurs, the excited whispers of homeowners who had spent years under Helen's thumb. The war was over. But Jake wasn't done just yet. He didn't just want to take control. He wanted to end the HOA for good. And tomorrow, he'd make sure that happened. Helen Grimshaw sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table as if holding on for dear life. The other HOA board members looked between her and Jake, their expressions ranging from stunned silence to barely contained relief. 4 years, Helen had ruled over this neighborhood like a self-appointed dictator, but now, the power was slipping from her fingers faster than she could grasp it. Jake adjusted his hat and gave her a slow smile. You look like you've seen a ghost, Helen. Guess you weren't expecting the same people you've been walking all over to finally push back. Helen's nostrils flared. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. Jake chuckled. Oh, Helen, it's so over it might as well be buried 6 feet under. The only thing left is how you want to go out, quietly or kicking and screaming. She shot up from her chair and stormed toward the door, but the moment she stepped outside, she realized the crowd was waiting for her. Homeowners who had been fined for having their grass too long, for having a single weed in their yard, for leaving their trash bins out a few minutes too late. The same people she had bullied, harassed, and nickel-and-dimed for years. They weren't afraid of her anymore. Someone in the crowd clapped. Another one whistled. Then, all at once, laughter and cheers erupted. Helen's face twisted in fury. She spun around, eyes wild, as if searching for some kind of ally. But there was no one left on her side. Not anymore. Jake stepped forward, taking his time, letting the moment sink in. You hear that, Helen? That's the sound of freedom. Helen's lip curled. You'll regret this. Jake sighed. I don't think I will. But you? You might want to start looking for a moving company. Her face turned beet red. I am not leaving my home. Jake shrugged. That's up to you, but you're not gonna like what happens next. She narrowed her eyes. What are you talking about? Jake smiled. See, while I was buying up properties, I also did a little digging into HOA finances. Turns out you've been dipping into the funds for personal expenses. Helen's confidence faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. That's ridiculous. I haven't stolen anything. Jake pulled a folder from under his arm. Oh, I never said stolen. But I did find HOA money spent on some very interesting things. Personal vacations labeled as community outreach. A brand new home security system, for your house only. HOA funds used to pay for landscaping at your place, but no one else's. Helen's lips parted, but no words came out. The board members behind her shifted uncomfortably, and one of them, a middle-aged man with a nervous expression, finally spoke. Is that true? Jake flipped open the folder. Care to explain these expenses, Helen? Or should we just let the homeowners decide what they think? Helen snatched the papers, scanning them with wide eyes. Her breathing quickened. She knew what this meant. Jake leaned in slightly. Now, I don't know if this technically qualifies as fraud, but if it does, the HOA could take legal action. Maybe even press charges. Of course, there's another option. Helen's eyes darted up. What? Jake smiled. You resign. Immediately. Walk away, and I won't push for an investigation. You stay, and I make sure every homeowner here knows exactly where their money went. For the first time, Helen had no snarky comeback. No smug retort. Just silence. She looked at the crowd, the people she had controlled for so long. They were waiting, watching, ready to tear her apart. She glanced back at the board members, who had already turned their backs on her. Slowly, Helen's shoulders slumped. Without another word, she turned, walked back inside, and slammed the office door shut behind her. Jake let out a satisfied breath and turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, the reign of terror is officially over." Cheers erupted again, louder this time. People clapped each other on the back, laughing in disbelief that it had finally happened. But Jake wasn't finished yet. He waved his hands to quiet the crowd. "Now, I know a lot of you have been living under this nonsense for years. Well, I got good news for you. We're not just getting rid of Helen." He let the suspense hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. "We're dissolving the HOA completely." Gasps, followed by stunned silence. Then, as realization sank in, the noise started again, this time a roar of excitement. One man raised his hands. "Wait, can we do that?" Jake grinned. "When you own the majority vote, you can do whatever the hell you want." It took less than an hour to make it official. The HOA board, now leaderless and powerless, had no choice but to vote in favor of dissolving the entire association. The paperwork was filed that same week, and just like that, Willow Creek HOA ceased to exist. Jake celebrated the only way he knew how, with a massive barbecue on his ranch, open to every homeowner who had suffered under the HOA's rule. Marge stood beside him, beer in hand, watching as families laughed and kids ran through the fields without a care in the world. "You really did it," she said, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd see the day." Jake smirked. "Me neither. But you know what they say, if you can't beat 'em, buy 'em out." She chuckled. "And Helen?" Jake took a sip of his beer. "Last I heard, she's trying to sell her house, but turns out people aren't lining up to buy a home in a neighborhood she nearly ran into the ground." Marge grinned. "Poetic justice." Jake nodded. "Damn right." The night stretched on, filled with laughter, food, and the kind of relief that only comes when a long battle is finally won. Homeowners who had once feared every little infraction now talked about what they would do with their newfound freedom. Some planned to repaint their homes without worrying about HOA-approved colors. Others were just happy they wouldn't have to deal with random fines anymore. As the fire crackled in the pit and the stars lit up the sky, Jake leaned back in his chair, content. 4 years, the HOA had terrorized this town. 4 years, they had acted like kings and queens, untouchable in their little kingdom. But at the end of the day, they were just people. People who could be outmaneuvered, outplayed, and, when necessary, completely bought out. Jake had fought back. And he had won. And as he watched his friends and neighbors finally enjoy their homes the way they were meant to, he knew one thing for sure. Some fights were worth every single second.